Hey, what's up, guys? Have you ever wondered how we actually make energy? Well, I wrote about this a couple weeks ago on my Substack to 25,000 people, Uncivilized or becomeuncivilized.com, and the engagement was wilder than I could have imagined. If you spend any time in the online health space, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos, you hear things like amino acids, CoQ10, electron transport chain, glycolysis, or even the Krebs cycle or TCA cycle thrown around. And to me, they've always just been like quite abstract concepts. So, what I wanted to do in that post and what I'm going to do in this video is really break down how we take food, eat it, and it goes through a number of processes and comes out as energy. And to go through all those processes, it requires cofactors, or additional pieces that help it, get through that different step in the process. I think understanding both how it works and then the cofactors required let somebody understand potentially what is actually going wrong with their metabolism or how they make energy. So buckle up for an explanation and make sure you smash that subscribe button so that you can find out about more health science goodness. First, let's kick things off by debunking just one core myth. When we eat food, it is not like putting fuel in a car. You can put gas in a car, and the gas itself is energy, like can be turned into energy. You can burn that without the car, and that will give you a reaction. When we eat food, it has to go through a number of very specific cellular processes before we can use it to make ATP, which is really the universal energy currency in the body. And we use ATP to have our hearts beat, to think, to warm up, even just to go for a short walk. So let's start with digestion. We eat some food and we need to digest it. What are we eating? Fundamentally, we're eating carbohydrates, fats, and amino acids, and they need to be broken down in our stomach, in our mouths, and in our intestines into smaller pieces. So carbohydrates are broken down into glucose and fructose molecules. Mainly that's with something called amylase, which is just an enzyme. You actually have it in your mouth. That's why sometimes when you eat potatoes, they can taste slightly sweet because you're in your mouth breaking down a starch molecule into a sweet glucose molecule. You also have fats, which are broken down fundamentally into fatty acids and a glycerol backbone. When you actually digest fats, you need to emulsify them in your intestines using bile, which comes from your gallbladder. And then once they're emulsified into kind of a hard-ish bundle, they can be broken down by an enzyme called lipase, and that will break it down into fatty acids and glycerol. You also need calcium to digest phospholipids, like phosphatidylcholine, but you find those in eggs and liver. Then proteins are primarily broken down in your stomach by hydrochloric acid, your actual stomach acid, and that like unfolds a protein really. Then it goes into your intestines and for further digestion, and that's where enzymes come and they break up your protein into individual amino acids. You need zinc and calcium essentially to make those enzymes run properly and break the amino acids down into their component parts. So when the food is broken down into your amino acids, glucose, fructose molecules, fatty acids, and glycerol, and that's in your intestines, you might think that that's actually inside your blood, but it's not. It's essentially still out on the outside of your body because nothing really passes through your intestines in the way that you might think about it. So we need to then get them into your blood. The simple sugar molecules like glucose and fructose pass straight into your bloodstream through your intestinal wall. The fatty acid and glycerol molecules absorbed through your intestinal wall, but then they're almost immediately repackaged back up into triglycerides. And the individual amino acids can pass through your gut lining into your bloodstream through a couple steps, but fundamentally that's how that happens. And a lot of the time, sodium or salt is a co-transporter. So actually salting your beef makes a lot of sense if you want to digest those amino acids. So at this point, we've taken food, we've chewed it up, we've swallowed it, it's gone through your stomach, it's gone through your intestines. It's then been absorbed into your bloodstream. Then have this stuff flying around your body, basically in your bloodstream. We then need to find out, okay, we need to get it into cells, and then inside of each cell is something called the mitochondria, and we need to get it inside the mitochondria. So glucose actually goes into the cell via something called a GLUT transporter, which is a kind of protein that sits on the surface of a cell and will bind with the glucose molecule and pull it into the cell. And the way that insulin works here, which is the hormone that most ketones are really scared of, insulin signals to the cell to put more GLUT transporters on the surface of the cell. So as glucose is flying past it through the bloodstream and through the system, it hits more GLUT transporters and more glucose is pulled into the cell. Once the glucose is in the cell, it is then taken through a number of chemical steps. Part of that is called glycolysis, and that takes a glucose molecule and turns it into something called pyruvate. Now remember that because that comes up later. And to go through glycolysis, you need magnesium in the cell and you need NAD+. Now, fructose can enter a cell through GLUT transporters as well. The GLUT transporters are mostly different to the GLUT transporters that glucose uses. And that mostly happens in the liver specifically, which is an organ kind of in the middle of your body. You're not really pulling fructose into the cell somewhere else in your body. In the liver, fructose is then turned into pyruvate, not really through the same process as glycolysis, but that's still the end product that it gets to. If there's a lot of excess fructose, then that is turned into triglycerides or fat in the liver. And if you have enough choline, so that's an additional thing you need, another cofactor. If you have enough choline, you can then package up the triglyceride into a VLDL cholesterol molecule, and it can get sent back out in the blood. Your body can use that fat elsewhere. So then we want to talk about fat. We've done carbohydrates, now we want to talk about fat. When fat was packaged up into triglycerides, the triglycerides actually were packaged up in something called chylomicrons. So chylomicrons and VLDL cholesterol from your liver, from the excess fructose, are then circulating around your body, and they encounter something called lipoprotein lipase, which is an enzyme that then unpackages all of those molecules back into free fatty acids. And we understand fatty acids fundamentally as the kind of base unit as fat. That's your linoleic acid or your stearic acid or your palmitic acid. And so these free fatty acids can then be transported into the cell using specific proteins. So now you have these fatty acids in the cell. Your short chain fatty acids are just going to stay where they are. They move on to the next step, totally fine. Your long chain fatty acids need to turn into something called fatty acetyl-CoA, and they're kind of activated when that is done, and that uses a little bit of ATP and coenzyme A. The amino acids in your blood are moved into the cell using amino acid transporters, just like what we covered with glucose and fructose and how they're pulled into the cell. And some of those transporters need sodium, chloride, or potassium. Not all of them, but some of them. And that gets it into the cell. Okay, so we have all of the key pieces we need inside of the cell. Also inside of the cell is something called your mitochondria, which people have learned in high school is the powerhouse of the cell. And in the mitochondria is really where we make ATP and energy. Side note, funny story. Up until about 2 years ago, I thought the mitochondria was a theoretical item in a cell. I didn't actually realize there are pictures of mitochondria. They are very real, absolutely proven. When we're down at this microscopic level of biology, like all of that is factually known to exist. So at this stage, we fundamentally have 4 things that we want to pull into the mitochondria to make energy. And I'll just say on the side, amino acids, turning that into energy is really like not something you want to be doing, but it does happen, especially if you're on a medium fat carnivore diet, a medium fat ketogenic diet or carnivore diet. So we have pyruvate, which is from fructose and also from glucose. We have short chain fatty acids, which are the short chain fats that didn't need anything. We have fatty acetyl-CoA, and then we have amino acids. Pyruvate, which came from carbs, just moves straight into the mitochondria with some specialized proteins, but nothing too challenging there. I'm realizing I'm saying fatty acetyl-CoA. There's no T. I just don't know how to pronounce that word. So fatty acyl-CoA, let's say. Fatty acyl-CoA needs to turn into fatty acyl-carnitine to move into the mitochondria. So just briefly think about this for a second. Long-chain fatty acids like stearic acid that ketoers, carnivores, and even, let's say, bioenergetic or pitas love, needs additional steps to get into the mitochondria. It doesn't move in as simply as the breakdown products of glucose. You actually need carnitine to get it from the cell into the mitochondria by changing that fatty acyl-CoA into fatty acyl-carnitine. Now, most people are actually carnitine deficient, and that's quite a big issue if you're trying to get the majority of your energy from long-chain saturated fats. In fact, I covered this on the Patchwork podcast with Amber O'Hearn, but there are a number of early studies in the ketogenic diet in children where they end up with pretty awful constipation. And the cure is effectively just giving them L-carnitine, oral L-carnitine. Without the carnitine available, they are not being able to produce enough energy in their digestion to move the medium through. Short chain fatty acids, I think I already mentioned this, but short chain fatty acids don't need any transporters. They can just go straight into the mitochondria. And this is kind of why medium chain triglycerides and coconut oil can be so powerful, because you don't really need anything. You eat short chain, you eat liquid MCT oil, which is really just liquid short chain fatty acids, medium chain fatty acids. And then through these steps, they're really just going through a little mechanical changes, but straight into the mitochondria. When the short chain triglycerides are inside the mitochondria, they are then activated into acetyl-CoA using ATP and coenzyme A. Amino acids can pass through the outside barrier of the mitochondria pretty easily, but the inner barrier is really selective in the kinds of amino acids that it lets in. The ones that it does let in, it will bring in through some transport proteins. Okay, so let's take a quick pause. We ate the food, we digested the food, we moved the food through the blood, we got it into the cell, now it's gone into the steps to get it into the mitochondria. It then needs to go through another process before we can produce energy from it. So pyruvate is converted into acetyl-CoA using the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. But that fundamentally, that doesn't really mean anything. The key thing is pyruvate is broken down into acetyl-CoA, which is what we want to use. That requires coenzyme A, thiamine, which is vitamin B1, vitamin B2, lipoic acid, and NAD+, which comes from vitamin B3 or niacin. Fatty acetyl-CoA then is through beta oxidation is broken down into acetyl-CoA, NADH, and FADH2. And the amino acids which have made it this far are broken down into acetyl-CoA and other Krebs or TCA cycle intermediates, which we'll understand in a second. And that's done through several different processes. But the key thing is, to do that, you need almost all of the B vitamins. So inside of a mitochondria, there is something going on called the TCA cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. And this is really the main way your body is taking molecules from food and turning them into energy. I also want to take a second to tell you about Patchwork. So Patchwork is a company that I run. We do nutrigenomic screening and organic acid testing. Fundamentally, we want to work out what's going on in somebody's metabolism and help them solve all of the issues. So we do that pretty simply. We take your genetics and then we will run them through all of the cutting edge published science on how different SNPs work. And we basically help people avoid mistakes with their diets and what's going on. So this is an example of a report that's available on our site. And we will take a look at what's the top items. So how you deal with different macronutrients, what micronutrient deficiencies you're likely to have, how different toxins or detox systems might be broken in your body, sources of genetic inflammation. For a lot of people, histamine shows up as an example. We kind of take all these different pieces and we go together and we say, okay, what diets are really likely to work well for this person? And we can give you some pretty specific obsessive versions of doing these diets specifically for weight loss if you're trying to lose weight. We deliver that to you on a 45-minute coaching call with a health coach. It's usually me. And also we can dig into all the details. So you have way more details through the whole report and all the specifics that show up for you. We look at all sorts of things in here. It's generally really an enjoyable experience, and we find things that people always had clues about, but they never really worked out. And the number one piece of feedback we have is, I didn't realize I was always making a mistake for my whole life by eating these things when really I should have been eating those things. Make sure you check it out. The link is in the description of the video. You might have noticed the main input will be a molecule called acetyl-CoA, which we have broken down everything into pretty much. So the TCA cycle is quite big and quite complex. There should be a picture of it on screen right now. But the main steps are this. Acetyl-CoA joins oxaloacetate to make citrate. Citrate is then rearranged and chopped up, which kind of releases some carbon atoms, and you actually breathe that out as carbon dioxide. As the cycle continues, the original oxaloacetate is reformed, ready to restart the cycle again with new acetyl-CoA. And it literally is a cycle. It just turns around and turns around and turns around. And for each turn of the cycle, you get 3 NADH, which is like an energy carrier molecule. You get 1 FADH2, which is another energy carrier, and you get 1 ATP and 2 carbon dioxide molecules. And so why is this important? NADH and FADH2 are high energy electron carriers. They specifically carry electrons up the electron transport chain, which we're going to talk about in a second. And that is where most of your ATP is made. It's best to think of the TCA cycle as the hub for your metabolism. It connects the breakdown products of all of your food and puts them into a process which hopefully is never ending to produce energy that your body needs. The TCA cycle is essential for life. If it stops, you are dead. And the cycle itself actually has a bunch of cofactors. So you need stuff like vitamin B1, which is thiamine. You need coenzyme A. You need lipoic acid. You need NAD+, which again, comes from niacin or vitamin B3. You need magnesium and you need calcium. And what can happen is, for a number of different reasons, genetic or environmental or the history that you've gone through, steps of the TCA cycle can break down. They can slow down, they can create bottlenecks, and you actually leak those acids out, or the acids that are in that step, you leak them out. And so you can fix that. You can take supplementation to make sure that there's enough of the metabolite that goes into the next step to make energy. It's kind of becoming widely believed now that most people have inborn errors in their TCA cycle because of the way that we've become this genetic mishmash as we've spread across continents and kept growing as a society. I have to put in a quick plug here. Most doctors don't realize that the TCA cycle can kind of be measured. There's this test, it's called an organic acids test. Like I mentioned, when a step in the TCA cycle breaks, the acids, which are the metabolite of that step, can leak, and you actually find them in your urine. So really easy test to do. You can do it at home. You just take a pee sample, and it can find the levels of specific organic acids in your pee that will dictate that pieces of your TCA cycle are breaking or running really inefficiently, or there's a bottleneck. You can also in there find the metabolites that are involved in detoxifying mold or dealing with bacterial overgrowth in your gut or neurotransmitter metabolism as well. At Patchwork, which is the company I run, we actually do organic acids testing and analysis. Now, these tests are notoriously very, very hard to interpret. You typically pay a lot for the test, and you pay even more to have someone interpret it, and a lot of people aren't too happy with the advice in the end. We do it for $300, but if you sign up to the waiting list on our site with the code UNCIVILIZED, you can get a $100 discount when we launch. So I want to talk about the final step, the electron transport chain. If you've made it this far in this video, you deserve a pat on the back. This is really, really scientifically dense and really informationally dense. And I just want the viewer, you, to have a really good model of when I eat this food, I'm not just putting fuel in a gas tank. I actually have to take that food and run it through a whole bunch of processes before I get energy. All of those processes can break. So if you're eating loads of food and you're gaining loads of weight and you don't feel any of that energy, like one of those processes is probably broken. From the step before we discussed, you had a couple of things kicked off by the TCA cycle, NADH and FADH2. Those are known as high energy electron transporters. So you use those to take electrons up the electron transport chain, which really let's say charges up a battery. And we're going to dig into that now. So if you've heard of complex 1 or complex 3, they're these different protein complexes, and when electrons go up the electron transport chain, they're going through complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as they do that, and the electron moves up the chain, you actually pump protons, which are your big positive heavy particle inside of atoms. You pump the protons into a space that's outside of the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So this is the whole idea of it being like a factory, right? You're moving electrons up the transport chain, and you're pumping these protons into the bit in between the inner and the outer membrane of the mitochondria. And that means that in that space, you're building up a charge, basically, right? It's all positive in that gap, and then you've got it like super negative in the electron transport chain. And then at the end of the chain, the electrons join with oxygen, which you would have breathed in, but you need carbon dioxide to get the oxygen into your blood. That's a whole nother story there. They'll combine with oxygen and with the protons to effectively create water. But to do that, the protons that are all positively charged and in this space, they actually want to flow back through the matrix. So it's like water behind a dam, right? As you're moving electrons up the electron transport chain, you're taking protons and you're putting them into this special space. They build up an amount of force. They want to flow through like water through a dam, and that's what they do. And they flow through a special protein called ATP synthase, let's say, and in doing that, you charge up ATP. So there's this rush of protons, and you create an ATP molecule. So there are a lot of cofactors involved, but really critically, the most simplified way to think about it is, the different complexes have needs. The critical cofactor needed to make the electron transport chain work is something called CoQ10, which is actually now a supplement, and you can get it. Not everybody needs CoQ10. I wouldn't worry too much about it if you're not taking it, but if you found it in an organic acid test, you can find CoQ10. And a good source of CoQ10 naturally is just polyphenols, so wine and colorful plants and stuff. I have a couple additional notes I want to make sure I cover, but that is how you take food, you mechanically chew it up, it goes through your digestion, pieces, bloodstream, cell, mitochondria, outer membrane, inside, and then into the TCA cycle, which we looked at on screen, then the electrical transport chain. Like, that's mental to me that we actually know that for a fact, that is science. And there are so many pieces in that journey that can break. It's like, no wonder most people walk around feeling terrible when there are so many opportunities for this system to break. Now, I want to add two bonus parts. I want to talk about ketosis and being in ketosis and ketones, and I want to talk about methylene blue. So I won't go into the details of how ketones are made, but they're fundamentally made in the liver and then transported through the blood around the body. We like them fundamentally for our brains, so we put them in our brains. Even when you're in ketosis, you're mostly burning fat in your muscles and your peripheral tissues for energy. So that still goes through the fat description we went through. But the ketones, the cool thing about ketones is that they don't need any specific additional transporters. So they then get into the mitochondria without any additional needs. They don't need any carnitine to do that. And in the mitochondria, they're then converted into our old friend, acetyl-CoA. And then that goes back into the TCA cycle. So ketones fit into this entire description we've discussed, but fundamentally, they don't need to go through the carnitine swap. They don't have to get transferred through loads of different things. Our liver makes them as well. And I'll say as an aside, if you have a slow liver or if you're seriously choline deficient, which again, we see at Patchwork, I'd say 99% of the users we see are pretty choline deficient, and genetically they need way more choline than the RDA, then you're going to have a really hard time taking fatty acids and turning them into ketones in your liver. Your liver just hates it. I won't go into massive detail on methylene blue, but what I will say is that methylene blue allows you to skip steps in the electron transport chain when you're trying to make energy. So it can speed up parts of energy metabolism there fundamentally if you have issues or pieces of that are broken or missing cofactors. So to finish, congratulations, you've made it. I wish I had a diploma to give you. You get to walk away with a biological understanding of how we make energy from food. Make sure you bookmark this video and you come back to it later on. I have found, once I fully understood this process, being able to then understand how different supplements work, how different pieces of science work, to be really much more useful, because I can go, oh, I know what part of the process that fits in. That's not a part of the process that I care about, because that part of my process is perfectly fine right now, and you can move forward. So I'll give you a B+ if you're still with me and you've learned anything, which is fantastic. In another video, I'll go through my results in my most recent organic acids test. I think that will be really interesting, and I'll break down what I'm doing to try and correct some of my issues that I found. Make sure you like and subscribe and hit that bell notification so you can get notified next time I make a video, which should be more regular now. And until next time, I hope you have a great day. Thanks.